One of the things that I feel very connected to is how do we move this forward? What do we actually do? And Richard Smith and I have been friends for 35 years, and we have the same argument all the time. He's always explaining, and as brilliantly as he did, you know, what is at stake. And then I'm like, okay, we have to do this, we have to do that, and it's never quite good enough, and I know that. But it's what we have. I feel very strongly that we need, as socialists, to look at what is actually happening on the ground and figure out how do we connect to what's happening on the ground and bring a broader politic to it. And when we do that, we see we have huge allies. We see we have huge potential. And I think it's important to not get distracted by a lot of the movement and the very broad movement that looks very reformist, because, as Richard said, things can happen all of a sudden and people can grow and think bigger quickly. So I just want to recruit you to the food movement. So, and this is what recruited me to the food movement, and I'm a relatively Johnny-come-lately on this one, because I've always been what I would consider sort of a democracy activist. How do we engage people? How do we get people to participate so that we can bring about another world? And so why the food movement? So what struck me, besides the fact that food as an issue connects to the environment, to labor, to poverty, to racism, to sexism, to global North and South divisions, the accumulation of capital, the destruction of the social fabric, the political fabric, the ecological and health fabric of our society by the food industry, that there's tremendous power of local movements to create change. And there are these local movements. There are people involved in urban and rural agriculture, hunger and poverty, health and health-related issues, retail and community food issues, including the small businesses that Richard was talking about that do have the potential to be relatively sustainable and very much part of a progressive culture. School food issues, engaging parents, particularly parents from low-income and working-class communities, worker and consumer co-ops, food worker organizing. There are about 2 billion food workers on the planet. That is agriculture, processing, distribution, retail, restaurants, and they're among the poorest and the ones with least rights and benefits, certainly. Land use issues, environmental toxins, people who are concerned about those kinds of issues in general, environmentalists. So to me, the potential of the food movement is enormous because it's very concrete. The environment, unless you have a very direct contact with the environment, which of course we all do, but you're really noticing it. Let's say you live in La Paz and you see that the glaciers that used to cover large portions of the Andes immediately surrounding La Paz are tiny little fringes now. You see that. You see that there's very little water that you can get. You see that it's being rationed. For most Americans, certainly, we don't experience the environment except as much as an incident like, not an incident, a climate catastrophe like Sandy occurs, and then we experience it, but people go back to the idea of, well, let's rebuild on the same spot. We're not necessarily learning the lessons from it, but people experience food all the time. They have a very personal and concrete relationship with food. And so it's something that brings them comfortably. People who are not activists now, it brings them, or haven't historically been activists, it brings them to contact with more political issues. Let's face it, if we're going to do the kinds of things that our the introductory plenary speakers I'm talking about, we are talking about mass movements, millions and millions of people in this country, let alone other countries are doing a better job of organizing than we are. But just in our own nation, we are going to have to engage millions and millions of people. They can't all be developed socialists yet, right? We need to be able to deal with parents that are concerned about what their kids are eating, people who are suffering from diabetes, people who want to have small farms and survive, people who are creating farmers markets, people who are struggling around their rights as food workers. These are the people we have to have relationships with, and we have to be able to politicize them so that they can be part of that. Also, one of the great things about the food, when we read the New York Times, they tell us about the foodies, right? The food movement. What is the food movement to the New York Times? It's the foodies. That's not the food movement I have any relationship to. I mean, those people are around, and that's nice. But what to me is the powerful part of the food movement is the community projects on the ground. Urban agriculture, the community gardens, the parents involved in school food issues, people creating farmers markets, food co-ops, food worker co-ops. These are, and the faith communities that are dealing with the crisis in obesity and diabetes. These are the grassroots groups. And guess what? They're not mostly white people. They're mostly people of color in a city like New York. And so if we're saying, well, where are the people of color? That's where I'm experiencing where people of color are. The food pantries. Why Hunger is a national organization that deals with hunger. And one of the projects that they have going is to work with the food pantries that are basically charities giving out food, which is an insane system that we have, because we know that there's so much hunger. In New York, it's 1 in 6 people are hungry. It's a very high number. But Why Hunger is trying to go to some of those food pantries. They're doing a pilot project and politicize them to try to help the workers there and the guests who come to the food pantries to have a broader understanding of the food system. It's not just thank you for giving me a box of Cheerios or giving me a turkey at Thanksgiving, and it's much more than that. It's what sustains many, many people. But to have a bigger understanding of how the food pantries fit into an understanding of the food system. So to me, we've got our work cut out for us. We have a lot of allies out there, potential allies out there, many of whom are people of color. The leaders of these organizations are people of color and poor and working class people. So they're not here, but we have a lot to say to each other and to learn from each other. So also these sectors create a sense of community, solidarity, and identity. And that is something we need very, very much in the socialist movement. We need to be able to create tight communities where people feel supported, they feel cared about, they feel like they're part of something that is meaningful to them. We have our institutions. We have the Brecht Forum. We have other institutions. But these very grassroots, often neighborhood-based groupings are very important for those kinds of human connections. And to have the sense of trust to be able to put your foot one step out and to take the risks that it will take to create a new society. And there will be a lot of risks. So the food movement, I would divide it into 2 parts. One is alternatives, alternative institutions like food co-ops or cooperative businesses in general, community gardens, urban ag like that. And then there are advocacy, policy / direct action groups. Very often the policy and advocacy groups don't engage in direct action. Hunger Action Network of New York State is an exception to that rule. Brooklyn Food Coalition, I hope, is also an exception to that rule, but mostly the advocacy organizations are sort of very straight-laced, not always, but often, and they are about affecting change on a policy level, and they have a lot of supporters, which is great. They have a lot of influence, and they should. but we'd like to also move them into more of the direct action and to bring some of the direct action people into the policy world as well, because we have to be able to make some of these changes, and we're probably not going to be able to make all these changes instantly. But we need to be able to do that. So, for example, one of the things that's going on now is the mayoral election, and Mark and I and many others are working on a range of ways to influence the mayoral candidates. Not that we're going to really influence them, but to say there is this huge constituency out here. We care about these issues, and this is what we want to see. So one of the things that that Richard and also Jill referred to is, how do we get local institutions to respond to planning, for example, right? How do we get capitalism? How do we start putting a lid on some of those, the most exploitive and the most dangerous practices? Well, one of the issues that we raise is, in the food policy world, is food policy councils. Food policy councils could be a whitewash. It could be just the heads of food corporations with a couple of hunger advocates in there, and we could say that's the Food Policy Council. On the other hand, we could have more and more the hunger activists, but also all sorts of other food activists that represent much more of a grassroots movement, and in some places that has happened. And that can be a kind of voice for planning and for a kind of moral consciousness to be able to speak to the public and speak to the government about what we need to be able to do in order to feed our people, and to be able to use food as a kind of economic development initiative that has environmental, health, and labor benefits to it. We could push that. And since the idea of a food policy council has happened in many other cities and other nations, that's a structural change that we could push for, and then work on that as one of the ways that we can start affecting some change. So I also think that that we need to look at some of the cross-sectoral and mutual support across boundary issues. That is, one of the things that happens in the movements is that they're very siloed, and we use this word a lot. So labor tends to stand by itself. Questions of feminism tend to stand by themselves. There are poverty issues, class issues that stay by themselves. Environmental issues stay by themselves. So one of the things about the food movement that's very powerful is that it gives us a lot of potential for cross-sectoral support and solidarity. So farmers and workers, we're going to be facing a farm worker bill of rights effort in mid-May. We're hoping to get some kind of as most of you know, farm workers and domestic workers have been left out of most of the labor legislation in order to get support. This is way back in the Congress from the Dixiecrats, when there were Dixiecrats. Now there are no Dixiecrats, but or almost no Dixiecrats. But the old Dixiecrats wanted to have domestic and farm workers out of labor legislation because, guess why? They were mostly black people and brown people, and they wanted them not to be able to have those rights. So the labor movement and the Democratic Party made that deal that we've all suffered from ever since. It's created, of course, a huge racist rift in the potential of the labor movement. But in May, the farm workers in New York State are proposing a Bill of Rights, basically, as domestic workers were successful in gaining. And we are hoping that the small farmers from the Northeast Organic Farmers Association will be able to move forward on legislation that can not bankrupt the small farmer, who is, by the way, doing very poorly, really struggling to survive because agribusiness is has so much concentration in it. to be able to support farm workers in their desires for overtime, for decent working conditions, and for benefits. And you should know, by the way, that many farm workers are if they have to go to the bathroom, they have to tell their the foreman, I have to go to the bathroom. They are timed, and if they take 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, then they're docked 5 minutes of pay, or clock goes back. So don't think they're washing their hands. So just be aware that the rules on farm workers are very, very strict and extremely horrible. Have bad health effects for everybody. There also are a lot of other cross-sectoral connections that we can make. Workers and consumers. So everybody wants cheap things. That's the American consuming way of life, right? We want the cheapest things possible. But we also have to be aware what that means. If we're going to have very cheap food, our food is actually very cheap compared to most other nations. We spend a smaller percentage of our annual income on food, and partly because agriculture is so the practices are so draconian, and also because we give so much of our tax money to subsidies for the commodity crops of corn, soy, wheat, and rice, and we also pay. We also give them a second kickback. These are the big corporations that are getting that money. Are in the Farm Bill, which if you want to know about the Farm Bill, you should. Why don't you put your hand up, Mark, because I keep referring to you. Mark can really talk with you in much greater detail about the Farm Bill, which is the omnibus legislation that structures the food system in this country. How many of you have heard of the Farm Bill? Okay, so great. You know about the Farm Bill, but my guess is that in the other group, in the larger group, most of the people probably haven't heard of the Farm Bill, but it's a really critical piece of legislation. The majority of the money in the Farm Bill is allocating food stamp support. Here's the problem with food. Of course, we want to expand food stamp support because it supports people who are hungry and they really need the money. But we also need to know that that money circulates at a very high rate within communities. It doesn't get the money doesn't get drawn out of the community; it gets spent in the community. So it's a kind of economic initiative. Problem with food stamps is that the level of food stamp support is so low that families that are on food stamps basically can only buy commodities. They're having a difficult time buying fruits and vegetables because fruits and vegetables are not supported by the Farm Bill, by taxes. So they're stuck. We're at the 12-minute mark, you're saying? Okay, thanks. So they're stuck having to buy corn, wheat, soy, and rice. And almost all the junk food we eat has those ingredients in them. So they're suffering from all sorts of health problems, often including obesity, because those are the products that they are able to buy on food stamps. And it serves as a second subsidy to agribusiness, because they're not just getting the subsidy the first time around in the direct subsidy for the crops, but the second time around forcing people on food stamps to have to make crappy choices for their food again. So they've got us on lockdown on this one, and we need to be able to understand these things in order to be able to support each other. There are all sorts of ways that we can support food workers, and I can talk about it more in the Q&A, because I think that's a really important issue, to be able to politicize the food movement. Solidarity between the global south and the global north. The most important thing we can do to support our brothers and sisters in the global south and farmers and farm workers all over the world is to pay attention to trade agreements. La Via Campesina is I think the largest non-religious organization in the world. It has about 200 million members, and it represents farmers and pastoralists and fisher folk and allies, mostly in the Global South, but in the United States, the chapter is called the National Family Farm Coalition. And we need to be aware of all these trade agreements and how they screw farmers, how they support agribusiness, and how they work against food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the concept of local control over the food system, and that's the basic politic of La Via Campesina. It's something that when you say, oh, buy local, and it sounds like, oh, buy local, it's so foodie. It's like, I want my organic arugula now. Yeah, we all want our organic arugula now, but there's a lot more to a local food system than just wanting those delicious and healthy products. It's about breaking down that global system into more manageable pieces where our food policy councils and our various other organizations can be more powerful. Also, we have to be aware of food aid. When there's a catastrophe, when there are disasters going on, and the United States government dumps food, they just passed their first policy, which is great, saying that and this came out of a lot of pressure, and actually the American Jewish World Service played a very positive role in this regard in the Congress in lobbying for, instead of dumping food, actual food that's grown in the United States on nations that are in disaster and therefore destroying their agriculture, right, undermining the farmers in those countries, that they should take those dollars and buy the food from the local farmers, support the local agriculture so they can come back again. That if you haven't seen Life in Debt, it's a great film. It's an old film, but on Jamaica, and it shows how this mechanism works. So we need a national food justice organization. Again, the words that I think people are using these days is food justice or food democracy. We need to be able to have an organization that deals with grassroots organizing and the big picture as well, that is pro-socialist and anti-capitalist. And finally, because we are always asking this question, how do we engage people of color? How do we engage young people? Colleges really have been very active in the food movement, sometimes in just wanting a little local farm, a little local garden, which we can all say ho-hum about, but also in supporting the immokalee workers, the tomato pickers in Florida, through the various fast food campaigns. Because in many places, especially New York, the food industry is a kind of new sweatshop industry. It employs mostly immigrant workers. It has horrible working conditions, extremely unsafe. These are struggles that we can engage communities and students in the future. Thank you.
What can I tell you? Coming from Mexico, working for many decades with peasant and indigenous communities in Mexico and throughout Latin America, what we see in this kind of conference that I'm attending here is how oppressive the way in which the expansion of the global economy has been for closing off opportunities for all of our working class, for the peasants, for the indigenous population. We also see an extraordinary intensification in the expansion of foreign investment in mining, in control of water resources, in the generation of electricity for international corporations, while substantial numbers of the local population still don't have access to drinking water, electricity, to good drinking water. Of course, everyone has drinking water in one way or another. Right now, North American mining companies have concessions on 40% of the land area of Mexico. Every mine in the world, I think, requires gigantic amounts of volumes of water for it to work. And so in most parts of Latin America, mining is a question of taking water away from agriculture. And so the struggle against mining is not only a struggle for environmental destruction, it's a struggle about food. Implicit in what I'm hearing now, what I've heard in the plenary session, is an extraordinary movement of people conscious of the need to restructure society. Nancy talked about Via Campesina, and she said it's the largest, interesting, I'd never thought of that category, non-religious social organization in the world. It's in 160 countries. I believe her number was slightly exaggerated, about 200 million.
I heard that from Kathy Cozy.
The figure that Via Campesina uses outside the United States is somewhere between 80 and 120 million. But what I want to talk about is that most people in Mexico, most people in Latin America, don't have, to use the expression, a snowball's chance in hell of escaping from the various kinds of cycles that lead Mexico now to have a higher rate of child obesity than the United States. The change in diets, the deterioration in health is extraordinary. But I'm going to stop here because what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about are the fact that 15 to 20 million Mexicans and something like 130 million Latin Americans are actually engaged in building alternative models. But they're not the kind of models in general that are discussed in a conference like this, because they're not models working at a superstructural level to change government policy. That's hopeless. Government policy in many of our countries is written in Washington and paid for in Washington, in the way that your government right now is doing everything it can to destabilize the Venezuelan government. And I think that you have to think about that, because Venezuela is a country which, under Maduro, would continue the policy of trying to increase local food procurement, local food production, changing a structure which has systematically been distorted. Venezuela imports 80% of its food right now. A country that has the potential to be, in 5 years, food self-sufficient is being denied that possibility right now through massive intervention of what your organization is called the National Endowment for Democracy. But however, in Mexico, as elsewhere, there are local groups, but not local groups like food co-ops that Nancy talks about, which are to be understood, to be enjoyed, and to be encouraged. When I talk about a local group, I talk 30 to 40,000 people each who are not consumers. Oh, I'm sorry, not just consumers, but rather people involved in rebuilding their societies through 5 principles that I would like to enunciate. They're principles that everyone in this room would be probably in agreement with. But they're principles that were written by the communities themselves and systematized. The first is self-management. Through a process of participatory democracy, very, very non-sexy words here in this audience. The second principle, solidarity. But solidarity means something different than what's talked about here, because it means rejecting proletarian organization of the work process. We're rejecting the actual notion of wage labor. And I'm talking about millions of people who are doing that because the work process itself is reorganized. Third, self-sufficiency, but again, in the way that Fred mentioned in his introduction. Not self-sufficiency at the expense of lack of organization, a lack of contacts among organizations, but self-sufficiency that includes exchanges among these organizations, so that you're not limited to the resource and climate base of a single community, but you develop networks for trade. Trade, which has taken on a cliche called fair trade in this country. 60% of fair trade coffee in the world is controlled by Nestle. I could go on and talk about fair trade in dairy products, fair trade in many other products that are also controlled by your favorite agribusiness giants. Self-sufficiency, then, is something that requires restructuring markets completely and rethinking the word, the very word. But it also means rethinking the concept of organic. How can you have an organic tomato grown in Florida or California sold in the Pacific, in the Atlantic Northeast? Its carbon footprint is gigantic. 63% of organic, what are they called? Spices, organic spices, are grown in Mexico and transported to the United States by airplane. I would ask you to think the next time you go to an organic part of your supermarket or to Whole Foods, where are they sourcing their products? Those mangoes, those organic mangoes or those organic avocados spent a lot of carbon getting to where you're doing. I'm not saying don't eat them, but I'm saying think about what it means. I could talk about each one of them detailed because we do studies about each one of them. The fourth principle is a principle of diversification, because self-sufficiency has been the route to impoverishment for community development over the decades. I don't have time to go into the details of that. And of course, finally, the fifth principle is sustainable regional resource management. What is a region? Can you be sustainable in a community of 250? We think not. For the communities that we're working with, they have chosen to use operationally the notion of the watershed as a regional definition, a natural regional definition. We could talk about, perhaps in some areas, watershed isn't the right definition. In most of Mexico, in much of Latin America, it is. We have a discussion in Mexico among the communities I want to emphasize that I'm talking about communities 30, 40, 50,000, but together they're 15 million people. In the minutes before the convocation of the inaugural session of this conference, I walked around the literature tables of the so-called socialist organizations that are out there selling their wares. What was really extraordinary to me is that there were 3 publications about the Zapatistas, each one of them more outdated and more inaccurate than the others. The Zapatistas, according to one of the articles I read, was started in 1994. That was the day they came up to, the rebellion was made public, but they started some 15 years earlier. And today, they're an inspiration for many things, but not the way that article was written in the one I perused at one of the tables out there. The struggles against Spanish control of wind turbines in Mexico, it's ironic that renewable energy in Mexico is a technology for impoverishment of people and taking the land away from the communities. I'm going to jump now because I want to talk about another important concept that is very, very important in these alternative communities that I called in the title to my talk here the hinterlands. I would like to mention El Buen Vivir, Sumac Causay in Quechua, Sumac Causay, a statement that a cosmovision, a cosmology that is said to come from Andean cultures of yore and is informing the very troubled and the very conflictual efforts in Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador right now. Bolivia has an indigenous president, Evo Morales, who is in the midst of all sorts of contradictions and struggles to figure out how to make compatible the demands of national governance with the demands, the legitimate, recognized demands in a new constitution of the 80% of the Bolivian population, or perhaps more, that is not only have indigenous roots, but is indigenous today. Bolivia has managed to control, in a way that is very, very important and must be understood, cocaine production. Not to eliminate it, but to make sure that the Bolivian people do it responsibly in terms of their own consumption of cocaine and its availability or lack of availability to Colombian cocaine producers as coca. I'm sorry, coca production. I'm sorry, I sometimes have problems.
New policy that I hadn't heard.
Yeah. No, they have regulated coca production, coca leaf production. In Ecuador, the president is in the midst of a gigantic conflict about how to develop a mining industry, a natural resource extraction industry, while proposing to the international community that one of its largest reserves of petroleum be left in the ground. But if it's going to be left in the ground, the people who live over that oil must be compensated. And Ecuador doesn't have the resources to do it. Are you, as US citizens, and your colleagues in Europe prepared to pay for the Ecuadorians to leave the oil in the ground? It sounds really good when Smith talks about it, but are you willing to pay it? 120,000 indigenous people in Ecuador will depend upon whether you're willing to pay for that. And, of course, one of the other large groups of peasant organizations in the world, which is famous and tremendously misunderstood, is MST, the Landist Peasant Movement in Brazil. Brazil has the largest organization of solidarity banks and a state-promoted alternative currency movement, which involves right now 30,000 different communities. Let me repeat that number, 30,000 different communities, and those communities, again, are not communities of 250 people, but they're thousands of people. So, trying to be a responsible member of this panel, let me end by saying, in much of the world, we will not make progress of building eco-socialism on a national level. We will have to strengthen what I like to call niches, pockets of sustainability. Pockets of sustainability which right now involve the participation in Latin America of 130 million people. I'm not talking about little organizations or consumer cooperatives or credit unions or things like that. I'm talking about people who are rebuilding, restructuring their communities, their way of life, and the buen vivir of sumak causai means not doing the way a woman said in the session, sacrificing your standard of living. No, changing your standard of living. It is not a question of sacrificing. Your standard of living is an abomination. The design of this auditorium itself is wrong. The use of energy, the design of a standard of life has to change. And people are doing that. There probably are lots of people in this country that are doing it too. But I think that there aren't enough critical discussions of the kinds of solutions that are being proposed to look at how do we build an alternative, better series of worlds, not one single world. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon. It's great to be with you here. I'm Brian Tokar. I'm part of an organization up in northern Vermont called the Institute for Social Ecology. And I've been engaged in a variety of movements related to food since the early 1970s. And that work has raised many questions for me over the years. And the question that I would like to pose for you today, and that we can maybe get into in more depth in the discussion, is, are there ways that our movements around food here in the United States, as full of potential as they are and as limited as they are, can potentially evolve in a direction where they would begin to look more like the movements that David told us about in places like Mexico and places like Brazil? A little bit about my history. I was involved in the Boston area back in the early 70s, involved in organizing a neighborhood food co-op. This was at a point when food co-ops saw themselves in much more radical terms than they do today. The co-op movement began in the 70s with a view toward really constituting an alternative to capitalist agriculture and capitalist food distribution. It's unfortunate that my friend Fred Magdoff wasn't able to be with us here today, because he would have reinforced, probably more than anything else, the extent to which there's more than enough food being grown in the world today to feed everybody. And it's really the constraints of the so-called market system that are responsible for hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people in the world going hungry. He would certainly emphasize, as you heard from the quote from his email this morning, the extent to which we can continue to grow enough food to feed everybody using ecological sound methods. The constraints aren't technological. The constraints aren't biological. The constraints have to do with the nature of this economic system that we're trying to feed ourselves within. A system that's incapable of viewing food as a basic human right, that insists that it's a commodity like every other commodity to be bought and sold and traded in the capitalist marketplace. For much of the 1990s and early 2000s, I was very involved in work both in Vermont and around the country and internationally around the genetic engineering of food, trying to stop this onslaught of biotech corporations like Monsanto to use this new technology of genetic engineering to consolidate their power and control over our food supply. And I want to reflect on some of the lessons and also some of the limitations of those movements, some of the incredibly inspiring work happening here in the New York area and really all over the country to bring food into people, closer to into people's communities, to make it possible for people in inner city neighborhoods that for many years have been deprived of access to safe and healthy food, to make it possible for people to feed themselves better once again, to begin to learn once again how to grow some of their own food right in the city. And there are some incredibly inspiring examples of that right here in the New York area. The question is, for me, to what extent can these movements begin to add up to a larger movement that represents more than the sum of its pieces, and that can more directly challenge the system of capitalist agriculture and, of course, the larger political and economic system within which those operate? So those are the questions that I want to raise for you today. And from my years of experience working on these issues, I would be dishonest if I didn't say right out front that I still have more questions than answers about how to really move forward with this. So I want to say a little bit more about each of those movements. The work around GMOs, of course, all of us who have been working on those issues over the years have emphasized a number of key points that clarify the nature of the threat that the biotech industry, Monsanto and other companies pose for our food system. We talk about the health consequences. We talk about the environmental consequences. We talk about the ways in which farmers here in the US and in Canada, who have been, for example, sued by Monsanto for the crime of their crops having been contaminated by Monsanto's genetically engineered traits. We talk about the consequences for farmers in the global south, who, through the intrusions of these very same companies into their communities, into their intimate processes of buying and selling and trading seed, have made it increasingly difficult for people around the world to continue to be able to feed themselves and to continue to be able to sustain the kinds of agricultures that we know are capable of continuing to feed the vast majority of people around the world. One thing that became very clear in the course of this work is the extent to which this technology of genetic engineering was being used by a small handful of corporations with roots in the agrochemical and industrial chemical industries to concentrate a level of control over our food supply that we'd really never seen before. One of the earlier speakers mentioned the names of some of those corporations: Monsanto, Syngenta, Bayer, Dow, DuPont. Through the early years of introduction of GMOs into the food supply in the late 1990s, every one of those companies spent tens and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars buying up seed companies. Why is it that so much of the commodity crops grown here in the US today are genetically engineered? It's because of that particular fact. And today, there's a small handful of companies that control 70 to 80% of the world's seed supply. And every one of those companies, or almost every one of those companies, have their roots in chemical production. Monsanto is now the world's single largest seed company because they've spent 15, 20 plus years buying up seed companies around the US and around the world. Other major seed companies include this synthetic company called Syngenta that is a result of a whole wave of mergers and divestments in the late 90s and early 2000s, trying to take advantage of potential synergies in various industries offered by this technology. The world's largest manufacturer of herbicides. Bayer, which since before World War II has been the largest manufacturer of insecticides. These are the companies that have used this technology to concentrate their control. And this was really one of the main focuses of the movement as of the early to mid 2000s. We did events every year in major cities around the country where the biotechnology industry would hold their annual convention. And we brought in representatives of third world farmers, representatives of movements around the world being affected by these policies. But most of the work around GMOs that continues today is from a very limited, very consumerist point of view. We're told that we need to put our other questions aside and focus on issues like consumer labeling. And people's right to know what's in our food is a very important thing. But we can't be limited by that. Similarly, the co-op movement, which established itself in the 1970s as a systematic alternative to the control of global food corporations, over the course of the 1980s and 90s became increasingly accommodated by that system with the rise of huge chain natural food stores like Whole Foods that for many years located themselves in a way that was aimed systematically at driving those community-controlled co-ops out of business. The majority of co-ops went in the direction of trying to fit into this new kind of economic reality of large natural food companies by becoming more like them. Most of the co-ops that did that have not lasted very long. And we know that the co-ops that survived that pressure are the ones that continue to focus on educating people about the nature of our food and continue to be engaged in challenging the system. Where I live in Vermont, we have co-ops that have been around since those days. More of them over the last few years have become collectively managed, have done away with the kinds of managerial structures that the consultants brought in and told them they needed to implement in order to compete with the big food companies. And there are people in that movement as well who understand that there's tremendous radical potential still in communities of people getting back control over their food. There's an interview a few years ago with a man in Oakland who probably many of you have read about, named Brahm Ahmadi, who's part of an organization in Oakland called the People's Grocery. They have not just a big co-op, but community gardens, a farm of 2 acres that grows significant amount of food for the community. He said, food is our medium for achieving broader outcomes in community development and public health and addressing disparities in opportunities and quality of life. We chose food as our tool because it's intimate and universal, as we heard from Nancy. We all depend on being able to eat every day if we can. Regardless of the differences in culture or personal preferences, we connect the dots to the structural and systemic issues of the food system. considering the global environmental footprint of food production, how far food travels, and equity issues related to farm workers and the struggles of small farmers, connecting those to the struggles of low-income consumers. We've already heard quite a bit this afternoon about the two leading edges of consciousness around food movements in the US and around the world today. One known by the name of food justice, the other described by its proponents, particularly in La Via Campesina, as a demand for food sovereignty. Eric Holt Jimenez, the current director of the Food First organization that was founded by Francis Moore Lepay back in the 70s, has a very interesting argument about the relationship between food justice and food sovereignty. Food justice, of course, is about access. It's about making, again, healthier food available to people in communities that for many years did not have such access. But it's limited by its hesitancy to directly challenge the system. The food sovereignty movement, on the other hand, partly because of the fact that it's a global movement, has challenging this system very much at its core. I wanted to show you a slide, and don't have time to, from I'll just write it down and you can look it up, a declaration that was made at one of the big international conferences of Via Campesina back in the late 1990s in a city in Mali called Nyeleni. And if you look that up online and read the declaration that came out of Nyeleni in the late 1990s, you'll read that the tens of millions of people who are organized in this movement see their work for food sovereignty. At the most basic level, it's defined as the simple understanding that everybody in the world, that every community, not only has the right to eat and the right to eat well, but the right to control the sources of their food. But they go deeper than that and raise a much more systemic, much more holistic critique of the nature of the food system, of the role of women in the food system, of the need for a community-centered food system that views itself at every level as a direct challenge to capitalist control over agriculture, and again raises these larger questions about the nature of the social and economic systems that we live under. Thank you.